This is barbecue boneless pork ribs and baked beans. The meat is juicy and flavorful and fall apart tender, and the beans are savory and sweet. These are two really easy things to make. Let me show you how I make them. First thing I'm going to do is turn the oven on. I'm going to set that oven to 275 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm going to get my cooking rack set up for the meat. This is a big aluminum sheet pan here, and I'm going to line the bottom of this big aluminum sheet pan with some parchment paper. You could use foil too, but I just like to line it with something on the bottom of the pan just to keep the juices from the meat from getting too cooked onto the pan. It just helps with cleanup. But the key to this cooking method is this grill grate here. This is just a camping grill grate that you can get in the camping section of any sporting goods department. Obviously, you could use any kind of rack that you have. If you have other types of cooking racks that would fit inside your sheet pan, you can use those. But this rack fits perfectly in these sheet pans that I have. And what I want to accomplish with this rack is to get the meat up off the pan. So as it cooks, the fat is going to drip and render off the meat and fall down onto the pan. What you're left with at the end is some meat that has had the fat rendered out of it, but the flavor is left behind, and your pieces of meat are not braising in a big puddle of fat. Now, of course, this is not required. You can just cook with just a straight up pan and not have the rack. You're just going to have a greasier meat at the end. So now it's time to prepare the meat. These are boneless pork ribs, otherwise known as country style ribs. I've noticed that these cuts of meat tend to vary depending on which store you buy them from. Different meat counters will have different ideas of what boneless ribs or country style ribs are. And obviously they're not ribs. There's no bones, but the thing that defines them as rib-like is the fact that they have this dark red meat. And that's very similar to the dark red meat that you get with ribs, those intercostal muscles in between the rib bones. This red meat in this boneless cut is very similar. In our house, this is what we call dark meat pork. This would be contrary to the white meat pork, which would be the really lean stuff that you get like in a pork loin. And as you can see, there are veins of fat coursing through all these pieces, and that's going to add a lot of flavor and juiciness to this meat when it's finished. And this package is probably still about 80% frozen. I just popped it in the microwave for just enough time so it's defrosted just enough so I could break the pieces apart. That's the nice thing about this cooking method, is the meat doesn't even have to be all the way defrosted. We're just going to put it in the oven partially frozen. And if there are any real big chunks of fat, like on this one here, I'll trim it off some, because it's just going to be a bunch of fat that I'm going to have to dump out later. There's plenty of intramuscular fat that's laced in between the muscles on these cuts of meat that there's really no need for these big hunks of fat on the outside. Now it's time to season the meat. You can go with just some ready-made mixes. Those would be absolutely good. I do that quite often. Just a regular rib rub mix, or even just seasoned salt is good too. But today I'm going to make my own mix of seasonings just for something a little more interesting. I'm going to start out with the obligatory salt and pepper. Lots of salt, lots of pepper. Then I'm going to add some garlic powder and some onion powder. I'm putting lots of seasoning on here. Some chili powder is next. A little bit of ground cumin. I'm just kind of winging it here, just picking stuff from the spice cupboard that sounds good. Some paprika. A little bit of oregano. I think this is one of the most underrated spices in the cupboard. And I'll put a little bit of ground mustard. And finally some celery salt. And I'm going to top that off with a little bit of oil on that meat. That's just going to provide a little bit of liquid so I can spread that seasoning around on the meat. Basically, I'm just treating this like a rib rub. I'm just going to use my hands and I'm just going to rub that seasoning all around, trying to get it in every little nook and cranny and crevice. And I'll rub the meat around on the pan a little bit, pick up all that seasoning that was on the pan. So now I'm going to transfer the meat from that pan onto the rack. And I haven't done anything to the rack. I haven't put any non-stick spray or anything. It's not going to stick. This is a coated rack. If you have a different kind of rack where stuff tends to stick, you might want to spray it a little bit, but I'm not doing that to mine here. Now I'm going to cover this with foil, but I don't want a tight covering. I don't want steamed meat. I want baked meat. So I'm going to cover the meat, and I'm just going to wrap the foil around the edges of the meat, but not the entire pan, if that makes sense. I want the meat to be a little bit protected from the hot and dry environment in the oven. I don't want it to turn into leather, but I also don't want to seal it up so tight that we're going to have steamed meat. So as you can see, the meat is covered, but there are gaps all around the edges where steam can escape. This is set it and forget it, slow and low cooking here. Those are going to go in that 275 oven for about 4 to 5 hours. So it's a little over 5 hours later, and I haven't even looked at the meat since I put it in the oven. Haven't done anything to it. Let's see how it looks. As you can see, the meat's fully cooked and browned, and the edges got a little browned there, but it's not dried out like leather. It's still juicy. And this is fully cooked and ready to eat right here if you wish to do so, but I like to do one more step, and that's to add some barbecue sauce. I'm just going to apply the sauce directly to the meat and then brush it on with a brush and just get it all completely coated. And I think it's important in this step to get the meat entirely coated with the barbecue sauce. Otherwise, the outer parts of the meat is really going to get dried out in the next step of cooking. And I just put a thin layer on here because I found if you put big gobs of barbecue sauce on here at this point, it pretty much just melts off and runs off onto the pan and just burns on the pan. So it's kind of pointless to put a lot of sauce. So I just brush on a real thin, just making sure every piece of meat is completely coated with the barbecue sauce. And once those are all coated, they're going to go back in that same 275 oven uncovered for the next 30 minutes. And while the pork is doing its last 30 minutes in the oven, I'm going to prepare some beans. My favorite beans are from scratch, but I'm doing it the easy way today with canned beans. Got 3 kinds of beans I'm going to be using: pinto, Great Northern, and butter beans. And I'm going to drain and rinse the northern beans and the butter beans. And then the pinto beans, I'm just going to dump the whole can with the liquid and all. I'm not a big fan of the bean liquid in the cans, but I kind of want a little bit in there just to make the beans a little thicker. Obviously, you could just dump the cans in the pot if that's what you like to do. And I'm going to spruce up these beans with a little salt, pepper, garlic powder, and onion powder, and also a little bit of paprika and some cumin, a little bit of Worcestershire sauce, some ketchup, and a tiny bit of mustard, and a few handfuls of brown sugar. Normally I'd probably add some barbecue sauce in here too at this point, but I was actually running a little bit low on barbecue sauce on this day, so no barbecue sauce in the beans today. So I'm just going to bring those beans up to a simmer and put the lid on, and then those can just sit there and simmer and stew for the last 30 minutes while the meat finishes cooking. My favorite thing to have with barbecue and baked beans is some vinegary slaw. This is just shredded carrots and cabbage that I make myself, and I'm topping it off with this mustard vinaigrette that I also make myself. You can find recipes for both of these things on my other videos if you go to my channel page. So about 5 minutes before dinner time, I'm going to take the lid off of those beans and just let them simmer with the lid off and thicken up a little bit. And here comes the pork ribs. As you can see, that thin coating of barbecue sauce has created a really nice glaze on the outside of that meat. And if you like them saucier, you could of course add some more barbecue sauce at this point. And there's no knife needed with these. As you can see, I can just pull these apart with the tongs. The meat is tender and juicy on the inside, and most of the fat has rendered away and is in the bottom of the pan. I'm just going to go ahead and break all these pieces in half, and we'll start serving it up. And here we have the fall apart tender boneless pork ribs and some super easy saucy baked beans. This meal is ridiculously easy. Probably took a grand total of about 15 minutes worth of work at the beginning, and the reward is pretty great. Well, I hope you found that recipe useful. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. See you on the next one.